We are moving on to slide number 9 on our PowerPoint for chapter 10 here. And I just want to take a few minutes to go over some of the PowerPoint slides and talk about how our muscles are built. And so if we look at slide number 9, it says the proteins of muscle. And our muscle proteins are going to consist of 3 basic types. We're going to have contractile proteins, which I've mentioned in some previous videos. The contractile proteins are the proteins that actually contract and shorten our muscles. Remember, they're the myosin and the actin. Then we have regulatory proteins that can turn off and on the muscle contractions. Some examples of these would be troponin and tropomyosin. And then we have structural proteins. Structural proteins are going to be involved in holding things together and aligning the contractile proteins properly and allowing for elasticity, extensibility, basically just holding things in place. So some examples of structural proteins would be this protein called titin, myomycin, nebulin, and then there's this one that you probably have heard of, dystrophin. Now, dystrophin is a structural protein that if you have a mutation of, you have a disease called muscular dystrophy. And so dystrophin is one of these structural proteins that helps align the contractile proteins, actin and myosin. Now, these proteins are going to build our basic muscular structure called a sarcomere. Now, a sarcomere is made up of these different proteins, and these different proteins are going to cause the muscle itself to contract and shorten. So it says the sarcomere is made up of actin and myosin filaments that overlap each other, and they contain these different bands. And I'm going to talk about these here in just a minute. But if we go to this picture that we've already looked at, I explained in a previous video that our entire muscle is broken into these clusters called fascicles. And then each fascicle is made out of 10 to 100 muscle cells we call fibers. And then the fiber itself is then broken into these structures called myofibrils. And if you look at a myofibril, the myofibril is actually built out of these sarcomeres. And what they've done is they've taken this myofibril and they've blown up one of our sarcomeres. And so your muscle is made out of millions of sarcomeres, okay? And the sarcomere is made out of those proteins I just mentioned. So there are actin and myosin, they're the contractile proteins. Then we have regulatory proteins like troponin. And then we have structural proteins that hold everything together. Now what's going to happen is this sarcomere is going to shorten. And when all millions of sarcomeres shorten, your muscle contracts. Let's look at this a little closer. I've got another slide here that's going to show us a sarcomere. And so the sarcomere consists of actin, which are these like purple little beads. So the actin protein. Here's a close-up of an actin protein. So it's kind of like a Twizzlers licorice stick all twisted up. And actin has these red-colored regulatory proteins that are on them that can turn our contraction on and off. The other contractile protein is this green one called myosin. Myosin looks like little golf clubs, all kind of twisted together. And the head of the golf club of the myosin is going to attach to the actin. What these are going to do is they're going to slide together. They're held together by all these structural proteins. So like myomycin, titin, dystrophin are holding the actin and myosin in place so that they can slide properly. Now, if we look at the sarcomere is broken into different parts, and they're all named. And it is important to understand these names. For example, it says each sarcomere extends from one Z disc to an adjacent Z disc. If I go back to this slide, these structural proteins that are holding everything together are called Z discs. So if we go from one Z disc across to another Z disc, all right, that is the sarcomere. Then it says a Z disc is a disc-like protein made of those structural proteins that attach actin myofilaments. So if I go back to this, you see how the actin, the purple little beads, are attached to the Z disc structural proteins. That's all that's saying. Then it says there's an area called the I band, which includes the Z discs and only actin myofilaments. And then we have an A band that contains the actin and the myosin. So if we look at this region of just actin is called the I band. And then this region that has actin and myosin is called the A band. So we're just looking at the overlapping of the actin and myosin. Then it says the M line is the middle of the sarcomere, which contains the H zone, which only has myosin. So if we look at this, the very center of the sarcomere is called the M line. And then this area where the actin is absent and the myosin is attached, that is called the H zone. And so I actually have a handout that has everything labeled. PowerPoint. This is PowerPoint number 14, and it's got all these labels. So see, we've got the Z disc. We've got the sarcomere going from one Z disc across to another one. See, this actually has two sarcomeres. So we have a Z disc, sarcomere, Z disc, and then that Z disc extends to another sarcomere with another Z disc. Then see the very center is called the M line. And then we've got these bands. So the I band is just this band that has actin. The A band is where the actin and myosin overlap. And then the H zone is this area, in the middle. I keep moving this, keep clicking on it. The H zone is the middle that only has myosin. And so what is going to happen here is that the actin and myosin are actually going to slide together. They don't change length or anything. They just slide together. So imagine my thumbs are the Z discs. My fingers are the actin and myosin. The actin and myosin are just going to slide together. And when you have millions of them doing that, you get a muscle contraction where the whole muscle shortens. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about this. So I'll just move to the next slide. And it says the sliding filaments. So the actin myofilaments slide over the myosin to shorten the sarcomere. They don't change length. It's not like that the actin myosin don't shrivel. They just slide on one another. Okay. It says the shortening of the sarcomere is responsible for the muscle contraction. And then when we relax, those sarcomeres lengthen again. So I've got a little diagram that shows how sarcomeres shorten. So the top here is a relaxed muscle with all of those bands and zones that we talked about. And then as we progress down, the muscle contracts. Now notice what happens when we contract. The actin and myosin slide against each other, and the actin is actually pulled together in the middle. And this H zone, this yellow H zone, disappears. So in a fully contracted muscle, there's no H zone anymore. And it's just gone. We also lose that I band. So the I band disappears too as the actin and myosin slide against each other. And so this is how the muscles actually contract. And so it's kind of important to understand the mechanics of this sarcomere. And I'll have a test question or so about the sarcomeres and how they function. So you need to know that they slide together. They don't change length. The proteins don't change length at all. We lose this H zone as the actin and myosin come together. Now, if you notice, a fully contract muscle, the actin is touching in the middle. You have a limit to how much you can contract your muscle. You can contract it to a certain point, and then it can't contract anymore. So when all of the sarcomeres contract, your muscle has a limit to how much it can contract. And if you exceed that limit, you can tear muscle tissue, tear the tissue, and damage the muscle. And that's happened before. You overexert a muscle and it tears. And it's going beyond these sarcomere limits. Okay, so that takes care of the sarcomere. I'm going to move in and to the next part of this chapter, and we're going to talk about how we get a signal to cause these sarcomeres to contract, because these sarcomeres only contract when they're told to do so by the nervous system. So next is talking about the nervous system sending a signal to these muscles to get them to contract. So that's next.